Hey kids, welcome to the garage. Today I'm sitting down with developer Awesreek, who's been hard at work on a little game you may have heard of called Viscerafest. Viscerafest emerged into early access last year and recently updated with the game's second chapter, a bunch of improvements and polish. We're going to take some time to chat about it. Awesreek, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the garage, bud.
Hola. Hello.
So you have been hard at work on this. So number one, I just want to say congratulations on the launch of Chapter 2. How's that feel for you?
Well, it could have gone a lot smoother. That would have been nice.
Yeah, you've had a lot of patch notes. You've had so much that you've been working on.
Oh god. Well, the biggest thing has been there's a lot of soft locks we didn't find.
Mm-hmm.
The elevator in the fourth level of Chapter 2 hates us. Has always hated us. And was the biggest mistake I ever made in designing a level. Is that
the one where you have to specifically look at the right button to click it?
Yes, but that is not why it was a mistake.
Oh, really?
No, okay. So, do we want to get into that right now?
I mean, hey man, you know what? Why not? Why the fuck not? We're here. We can do it.
So the issue with that elevator is there's about 1,000 different ways the player can approach that specific puzzle, right?
Right.
Because so the way the puzzle starts, you go down the elevator, you hit a switch, and it will bring up the push puzzle, right?
Sure. Yeah.
You solve the push puzzle, and now the elevator unlocks its third floor. Now the player can go up the elevator, and then what the player has to do is they have to jump across to the other platform. Mm-hmm. When they do so, a shoot switch will rise on the elevator. Mm-hmm. You shoot the shoot switch, which will lower the elevator, and then you hit a switch that's on the platform you're standing on to raise a bridge. And the bridge can't raise if the elevator's in the way, which is why the shoot switch is there.
Right.
So the basic structure of the puzzle itself is you need to get the bridge up so you can cross, and so you shoot a shoot switch to lower the elevator so you can go through the door. The issue is that there's about 1,000 different ways the player can approach this, because what will happen is that the player will go up to the top of the elevator, and the shoot switch will raise up, mm-hmm. and immediately while they're inside the elevator, they can shoot the shoot switch. Mm-hmm. And then they can, if they want, and so, oh god. So when you shoot the shoot switch, it lowers the elevator on a timer, so there's a tight limit within which you have to raise the bridge.
Got it.
Problem is, if you're inside the elevator, you shoot the shoot switch, you can also hit the switch to raise the elevator again. Whilst it was... Yes. Additionally, the player could also fall off of the elevator. They could, there are thousands and thousands of variables as to a specific sequence of actions the player can do.
Oh no!
And whenever you have something like that, you have to account for every single different possibility in terms of what could happen.
Sure.
You have to, because first of all, any one of these sequences could break saving altogether.
Right.
The elevator, during testing internally, there were so many times where that elevator would break because of the saves. Mm-hmm. Because basically the elevator has to trigger between 3 completely different states. I'm not sure how we handle this internally. We might actually just have 3 different elevators that replace one another during that sequence.
Oh my god.
But yes. So basically there's the first stage. The elevator has to go between the first 2 floors. Mm-hmm. So that's the floor you start on and the basement below. The second state is the elevator gets locked down when the puzzle is initiated, so you can't use it.
Okay.
The third state, actually I guess there's 4 states. The third state is where you can raise the elevator to the 3rd floor, and then the 4th state is when it's locked to the 2 bottom floors again, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So first of all, that presents an absolute nightmare from a saving standpoint. Because for starters, saving mechanics are probably one of the single hardest things to do when making a game. Because you need to tell the game... First of all, it's hard to make an optimized, fast, and quick system for this. Because the issue is the way saving works is you, the developer, have to tell the game what it needs to remember, right?
Uh-huh.
And if you tell the game to remember everything, then it's going to take forever to save.
Oh, okay. I mean, that makes
Like,
sense.
that's what.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why like loading times can be so drastically different from game to game.
Okay.
Is because what they're basically what they are remembering can be vastly different depending on the situation.
That actually makes a lot of sense. I've never considered that before, and I'm kind of surprised I've never considered that before.
Yeah. So like just to give you an idea of what I mean when I say it, we have to tell the game what it needs to remember. With a single enemy, we need to tell what its exact coordinates are, what it's doing during those coordinates, where within the action it's doing those coordinates within, and if the enemy's died, there could, if we wanted to save this stuff, there could be potential random variables like, is the enemy jibbed? If it's not, then like, what properties does it keep? Or where are the jibs? It's one of the reasons why a lot of people have noticed prior to this update, when you would load a save, all the enemies jib again, and that's because the game's remembering that it was jibbed, but it's not remembering. It's not remembering where the jibs were because that would take way too long to gather and pointless to gather all that information.
So it just re-jibs them.
So it just re-jibs them. And additionally, because of that, we also had to determine if it was jibbed, we had to make sure they weren't dropping their hearts again.
Oh, shit.
Yeah. So that way there wouldn't just be suddenly a bunch of hearts everywhere. Like, right. And that's just one enemy, right? And like that has to be duplicated across every enemy in a level. And like this, and this includes things like doors, scripted sequences, like. And scripted sequences are probably the worst.
Oh god. I mean, yeah, now that you're walking us through all of this, all of these steps, like the different mechanics and the measurements and how things need to be in certain places, and then you throw like, wow, a scripted sequence in the midst of all those variables. That's gotta be murder.
Because I think the two big ones in Chapter 1 that I remember have consistently given us the biggest headaches. Mm-hmm. So, in the final level of Chapter 1, there are two big pains. First one is the Thunderbird Hell Room, is what we call it.
Oh, fuck. Yes, it is. Fuck. Oh, my God.
So what happens is you hit a switch, it spawns in a bunch of enemies outside of the room you are in. Mm-hmm. It lowers, after doing that, well, actually, okay, let me phrase this. So it spawns all the enemies in the room outside of where you are. Mm-hmm. It raises a platform that has a drone on it outside of the room you are in. Mm-hmm. It lowers all the shields except for 2 in the room you are in. And then it spawns all the enemies in the room you are in. Mm-hmm. And it does these over the course of a specific time frame, right? Now, when we are telling the game what it needs to remember, we have to tell it where in the sequence of these events it is. We have to tell it what it hasn't or hasn't done yet. We have to tell it what has spawned and what hasn't spawned yet. Again, just like thousands of variables. And there would be so many times where people would save in the middle of that sequence, and then suddenly none of the enemies would spawn.
Oh, no.
Or all the shields would still be up. Or all the shields would be down, and they could just skip that segment altogether. But just like, again, like thousands upon thousands of ways that sequence can break because of like all the different variables that need to be remembered when you're doing something
Jesus
like
Christ,
that.
That's wild. Well,
it's one of the reasons, I'm sure you've probably noticed, there are a few moments in Chapter 2, outside of like boss fights, where we prevent the player from saving.
I did notice
because
that.
Those sequences in particular, one, you don't really need to save during them.
Yeah, sure.
Like the push puzzle sequence right before the elevator.
Yeah.
Like, we're not throwing anything at you until the boss anyway, so there's not really a need for you to save. Mm-hmm. But like that sequence right there, that's like a really vulnerable sequence that could easily be broken by saving. So that we're just like, hey, you don't need to save here anyway, so we're just not going to let you.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, just lots of saves are basically our number one bug generator.
Jesus.
And we usually will ask our beta testers to basically just use a cheats and just go around saving everywhere to find problems.
Nice. Nice. That's the easiest way to go about it. Save everywhere. Mm-hmm. Anywhere you can. Wherever you can think about it. Just fucking save and let's see what happens. Just tell me what breaks. So, like,
it's one of the reasons... Oh, sorry.
Oh, no. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
I was going to say, it's one of the reasons why the save beacon system is such a blessing and a curse.
Yeah.
It's because, one, it limits the potential of something like that happening to a player because they can't save scum.
Right.
But it also makes it harder for us to find those problems because you can't save scum.
Right. I mean, unless you gave beta testers like unlimited save beacons to just go and run around.
Yeah, again, and that's why we have them. We have a cheat specifically to like basically just fill them up with save beacons.
Oh, nice. Fantastic. Yeah. So I guess then in terms of comparison, so like with the release of Chapter 2, like all the different soft locks bugs, everything that you're working on, and like comparing that to when you released Chapter 1, like has this been a little bit smoother? Has this been like a little more difficult? Like how would you compare the two in terms of like the launch and the amount of patching and work that you've had to do post-launch?
I want to say Chapter 2 is probably worse.
Really?
Just because, first of all, going into Chapter 1's development, a lot more of our beta testers were available to test things. Right now, everyone was kind of in a super chaotic, busy period in life.
Right.
Where there was very limited availability.
Right.
And as a consequence, our testers were not able to push things as hard as they were during Chapter 1's release.
Right.
Secondly, the bugs and soft locks and whatnot in Chapter 1 were, well, not the bugs, but the soft locks specifically in Chapter 1 were a lot harder to find because they were so context specific, whereas like some of the soft locks in Chapter 2 you could just do accidentally and were so so for example, probably the biggest and most annoying soft lock is on that elevator puzzle.
Right.
Where what would happen is if you fell off of that elevator when it got to its third stage, you were soft locked because there were switches at the base of the elevator that weren't working, that were supposed to call the elevator down so you could get back up. And like something like that, it's like so easy for players to just like fall off the elevator because it requires a little bit of platforming to get across. So it's like that's a really like boom, like immediately right there. It's like the easiest soft lock to get. Some of the other ones aren't as egregious, but there are still some notable ones that are like super annoying and problematic. And there are a few areas in which I'll say there are some mild balancing oversights that I think hurt people's experience more with Chapter 2. And I think the other thing to note with Chapter 2 is the bugs feel more egregious because it's harder.
Okay.
Like with Chapter 1, it's like, Chapter 1 is challenging, but it's not as challenging, obviously, as Chapter 2 is.
Right.
And as a consequence, like, when things get screwed up for a player, it is 1,000 times more frustrating because it's like they've probably already been struggling up to that point, and when the game breaks, it tends to be infuriating.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'd say probably worse, especially again because, like I mentioned, like the main save bugs we ran into with Chapter 1, we're just like. They were very context specific. Like you had to save like right at this moment, like right after you hit the Thunderbird switch, you had to save right then, and then that sequence would break.
Got it.
So like not everyone was even running into that issue because some people would save for it, some people would save after it. Like and as a result, like it was again just kind of a mixed bag, like whether or not anyone was going to find it. But yeah, the more frustrating thing I would say with that specifically is in terms of the Chapter 1 stuff, I'd say we attempted to fix those problems multiple times, and like somebody would find the one single moment in the sequence they could save to break it still. So it was like we'd fix part of the sequence breaking, but not all of the sequences. And I don't think, like, thankfully, the kind of bugs we're having with Chapter 2 aren't like that. Like, they're easier to fix.
Sure.
But they're, like, probably worse and more noticeable.
Ooh. Okay.
Yeah.
So then, so outside of like bugs, soft lock glitches, stuff like that, like coming out of Chapter 1 and the feedback and reception that you got from gamers and players, like was there any feedback that you got coming out of Chapter 1 that you took into account when you were developing Chapter 2?
Probably. It's kind of hard to say because I'd say like the portion of the audience, I'd say the biggest thing was the placement of save beacons.
Right.
Was probably the number one. Probably the number one thing I took note of coming out of chapter 1.
Right.
Because when I was playing through chapter 1, right, I was placing save beacons based on the frequency that I personally felt I would need them, right?
Okay.
Basically, when I'm balancing Viscerafest, I play on the 4th difficulty, which is effectively the intended difficulty.
Okay.
And I go through and I figure out kind of based on my experience, based on my own personal tastes and whatever, kind of how I would want that experience to be balanced, right? So I was placing save beacons at a rate where it was like, oh, this section only takes like a minute. So I'm right, like it takes me a minute to get through the sequence, so I'll put a save beacon here.
Sure.
But what it led to was there were a lot of like moments where there were like really brutal fights and there wouldn't be a save beacon right after that fight because I was like, oh, it's just too soon to put another save beacon down when like people were regularly dying to like just the middleman encounters.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah.
So I'd say like one of the biggest things coming out of chapter 1 was just effectively reevaluating how I handle the placement of save beacons. The other big thing I noticed coming out of chapter 1, and I don't think this was something people complained about, but it was a problem I had with chapter 1. And we actually, it's one of the things that was patched up when we pushed chapter 2 out. I put a lot of ammo in secrets. I didn't really account for the balancing of ammo in secrets, and there wasn't much else but ammo in secrets. Like there would be scullies and stuff occasionally, but like I wasn't putting save beacons in secrets. I wasn't putting armor in secrets, right? And I was like, yeah, I should probably like vary up my secret types a little bit more.
Yeah, sure.
One because people who knew where the secrets were constantly overstocking on ammo to an absurd extent. And two, it was like, you know, like it would be more like having the opportunity to save more often, as well as getting more armor and stuff like that's still valuable stuff to be able to give players within the context of secrets and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'd say those two things were the biggest things I came out of chapter 1 with. But a lot of what we did in chapter 2 was more so like based off of what we generally plan to do. I'd say probably as early as 2020. I mean, like, we've had a rough outline of where the game was going forever now.
Right.
But as early as 2020, I would say, like, most of the game's direction has been solidified. I've had the final cutscene in writing since 2020.
Wow.
I've changed it a little bit in terms of, like, I'll improve some stuff, I'll make some tweaks here and there, but it's like the same things still happen in the cutscene. It's just how it's presented changes.
Sure, but you have the ending. You have that ending right there, and that's kind of like your field goal.
Yes.
That's awesome.
And actually, we'll probably be working on that in a couple of months now.
Oh, wow.
That's not too far away. It's
no,
that's
not
scary.
Far away at all.
We're currently working on the...
No, good.
Sorry?
I was going to say, you've been working on this for a while. Like,
yes,
even before, like, because if I'm doing my math right, like, based on stuff that you said on Twitter, like, this is a story that you've had on in your head for, like, what, last 10, 12 years?
Not entirely.
Not entirely.
So the game has been in development since 2012.
Okay.
But a lot of that early period was kind of trying to figure out what the game was even going to be.
Right.
Like, I knew it was going to be a science fiction first-person shooter, but, like, the early versions of it were more like Halo than they were like Doom. It wasn't until probably about 2013, 2014 when it started to go a more retro shooter direction, and I wouldn't say some of the current story elements started to even come around until 2015.
Wow.
I would say the point at which the story started to kind of be... to effectively roughly look like what it does now was probably about 2017, 2018 timeframe.
Wow.
And then, and don't get me wrong, a lot of stuff has been tweaked and changed since that time.
Yeah, no doubt.
Like for example, Dr. Mortis wasn't even a character in the game until 2019, I do think. Yeah, like tons of stuff has been like tweaked and modified, but like the general overall like where the game is going and how it's going to end, that has been established since probably about 2017.
That's so fucking cool. Yeah, I've had some stories that I've worked on. I've like self-published a couple of books, and I had a character that I like made like 15 years ago and just like kept going and going and going, and eventually finally worked into writing a couple of books and then putting them out there. So like, I find it really fascinating to have an idea for like a story, game, book, whatever, and taking that and like slowly evolving it over time. Like, I'm very fascinated by the notion of like where an idea that someone has been working on for like close to a decade, where it started and how it evolved over time. Like, to see that timeline of events and that evolution, shit like that's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
And then like, so when you bring about chapter 2, and with that release now, there are there's new things that you have brought in. So we've gotten new weapons. We've gotten some new enemies that we've seen in the game. And so with what you've brought in, with the new stuff that you've brought in, was there anything that you had kind of planned on putting in there, or maybe were considering, but you ended up having to cut or maybe push back into chapter 3?
Kind of, yes. Well, first of all the chapter 2, so like I said, most of the game has been planned out for a really long while. A lot of the enemy types that are currently in chapter 2, they're old. Like, some of them hail from like the 2016 version of the game.
Right.
So like the potato, for example, he's probably one of the oldest enemy types. Actually, no, the potato was from the 2015 version.
Really?
Yes, he's ancient. He's been a favorite of mine for a long time, because I have a really old sketch of when I first drew it. He looked like a little potato with just like, but like, and there was like a little skull sticking out, and like the top of the potato looked like a hoodie for the skull.
That's awesome.
He didn't even have legs at that point, I don't think.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He was like literally just a potato.
Oh my god, that's amazing.
Yeah, I think so the original version of him in like 2016, he just fired like rockets, basically, is what he did. No, he started out, he was firing like really big bouncy projectiles. They aren't quite grenades. They were really weird, but then he got changed into firing rockets. And then when we brought him over into the Unity build, I was like, let's make him like a rapid-fire homing projectile enemy. And that turned out really interesting, because the way even more interesting than I intended it to, because the way homing projectiles are handled in Viscerafest is really weird.
Really?
I can't actually describe it, but like the way homing projectiles usually work, right? Is they effectively they're chasing down a target, and they aim at the target's direction, and there's just like a slight delay, like to how fast they can like reorient themselves when the target moves, right?
Okay.
So like you'll have like something like the Revenant missile, where it's like, if I move, it doesn't perfectly track my motion, like slowly orients itself to get back to where I am.
Okay, that makes sense.
That's not how Viscerafest's projectiles work. I don't remember how they work, because it's actually kind of complicated, but it leads to this really odd situation where how sharp they can turn is kind of based on how you move, as opposed to like any limit on it. It's more so, I think the way I can best describe it is that it's not how fast they turn, it's how fast they move. So they can do like so they can do like a really like sharp like 180 turn on you, but like they'll like slow down at the tail of that turn, so you can kind of manipulate their movement. Like a really common tactic I'll use to get rid of them is I'll jump, do a quick WASD like twirl in the air, and by doing so I can lead them into the ground around me.
Ooh.
But the interesting thing with the potato is because he uses that AI for his homing projectiles,
Right.
and they move really slowly, but he spams them, it actually makes him an absolute nightmare in wide open spaces.
Oh my
Whereas,
god.
like usually, when you have a really big wide open space, it's so easy to avoid everything that's thrown at you because you have so much room to maneuver around.
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas with him, it's like the exact opposite. At the end of chapter 2, you'll probably remember this, that really big fight in the final arena.
Yeah, right before Marty's.
I had like 2 or 3 potatoes in there, and that fight was impossible.
Oh,
Like,
no.
we had to cut it down to just 1, and even then, there are times where I'm like, maybe that's still too much.
Oh my god. No, I like literally just like felt the anxiety of that. Just thinking, because first of all, that's a great moment. I really loved the way that you played out that moment in that arena where like everything slows down for a second. Like it almost looks like it's there to give the player a second to reorient themselves with how many enemies are in this room. And it's a great fight, but like, oh my god, though more than 1 potato, even the 2 potatoes, let alone 3, like that just hit me in the chest.
Yeah. There's only 1 potato in that arena currently.
Mm-hmm.
And like in tighter spaces, they're fine. But yeah, in wide open spaces, they are such a pain. And that arena is like probably the biggest arena in the game so far. And it's massive. And whilst there are points of cover, because of how much you have to move around to avoid the other enemies, you just don't have time to take cover.
Right.
And yeah, when there were 3 potatoes in there, that fight was like genuinely unbeatable. But as for enemies that got cut or removed or changed,
Mm-hmm.
or moved to chapter 3,
Mm-hmm.
there are a few. One that I remember early on was there was going to be a new melee enemy type. I forget what it was called, but it was actually a variant of the Enforcers.
Mm-hmm.
The Enforcers are like, they spam the pink projectiles.
Right.
They're from chapter 1. It was going to be it was that species of alien, and it was going to be a variant where it had like blade arms, and you know how like the Thunderbirds, they'll do like their little melee dash.
Yeah.
Basically, that was exclusively how that enemy was going to maneuver around the arena.
Oh damn.
Oh
damn.
Yes, I think the reason why that got cut was just because like there were so many other enemies that we had to include that we just was like, we have to cut something.
Mm-hmm.
And of the things to cut, it was like that should probably be one of them.
Right.
The Grenadiers from chapter 1 were not originally supposed to come in until chapter 2.
Oh really?
Yes. So originally what they were going to be is there's the standard trooper enemy type, right? And the standard troopers, they fire the 3-round projectile burst.
Mm-hmm.
And then in chapter 2, there was going to be an armored variant of them that had a grenade launcher.
Mm-hmm.
When we were working on chapter 1, we had an enemy type called the Ratakathol, or that's its species name, I should say.
Okay.
That species ended up becoming the Grenadiers. But the reason it ended up becoming the Grenadiers was because in early test versions, what that enemy was doing was he would fire a single arcing acid projectile that would leave a puddle on the floor when it landed. And it was really boring. It was incredibly underwhelming and uninteresting mechanically. It also just kind of felt off and janky, because it just felt like another projectile throwing enemy. It didn't feel like it added anything to the combat space.
Okay.
So we were like, okay, let's just take the Grenadiers and move them to chapter 1, and I'll make this enemy type the Grenadier. Then, let's see. Oh my god, there were so many weapons that were cut. Like, Viscerafest has had so many weapons come and go throughout the course of its development that there's nothing I can explicitly say was cut from chapter 2.
Right.
The Unity version of Viscerafest has had mostly the same arsenal throughout, but the one weapon that was replaced that was going to appear in chapter 2 was called the Cauterizer. And the Cauterizer was basically it was in the world, it was a mining tool, where it would just fire a big red laser, and it was basically like the lightning gun from Quake.
Ooh, nice.
That got replaced with the barbecue belter because I thought that would be more interesting.
Yeah, honestly, like that The barbecue blaster, holy shit. That is such a good fucking weapon. Like, I said this in my review video, and I'm going to stand by this, but that is the single best flamethrower I've ever used in any video game. It is so satisfying. That shit is so satisfying to fucking use, my guy.
Oh, that reminds me, actually. So, part of the barbecue belter's functionality was kind of a happy accident. So basically the main use for the barbecue belter is that you use it to dispatch shielded enemies. But it originally didn't do that. It was just the flamethrower, and don't get me wrong, it was really powerful. And it always has been, and I always wanted it to be, and we were just going to like limit how much ammo you got to kind of reel it in a bit.
Yeah, sure. That makes sense.
But we were planning to introduce it right at the beginning of C2L4, or Ethereal Egress, which is the 4th level of Chapter 2. And I was structuring that first encounter, and I was like, man, there's so many hellbirds here. Like, because it was like, this was meant to be like the hellbird shining moment, like the level they were going to be introduced in. And for me, because like basically the hellbirds are actually another happy accident. Because I was going on a walk, and I was thinking, like, what would be a really fun, easy enemy we could make real quick for Chapter 2? And I was like, oh my god, I have a terrible idea. I whipped out my phone. I can look up the exact message I sent him right now. But basically, I got Fireplane a message, and I said, I just have an amazing idea. And he goes, what? I said, so imagine, we have an enemy, and it's a Thunderbird, but it has the drone shield. and Fireplant was just like in shock. So I was like, we're doing it. And like right then and there that day, I threw the sprites together. I sent them to Elijah, and like I think the next day we had it working. It was amazing. It was just like that one of the happiest days of my life. I was like, everyone is going to hate.
Oh yeah, when you introduced that on Twitter, I immediately was like, "Oh god, dude, come on!" Are you fucking kidding me?
But I was making that level, and I was just like, man, it feels really bad to introduce the barbecue belter here and have all these enemies that I can't kill with it.
Right.
So I was sitting there for a minute, and one thing we had done prior is we had So I was sitting there, I was thinking about it. It's like, what if all the fire-based weapons could pierce through shields? So I basically shot Elijah a message, and I was like, hey, what if we made it so that explosions and the barbecue belter could pass through shields? Would that be a pain to do? And he's like, yes, it will be a pain to do. And I was like, but can you do it? And he was like, yes. So, like, yeah, again, over the course of the next day, we got it working, and, like, the second I popped in there and I started basically restructuring that account, I was like, this feels amazing.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, this is so good. Because I was worried, I was like, man, the barbecue belter just kind of felt like another weapon at that point. It was super powerful, but it just kind of felt like another gun. It didn't feel like a meaningful addition to the arsenal. And I was kind of...
Uh-oh.
Oops.
Oh. Nope, we're good. You're back. I got you.
I'm back. I don't know what happened.
Yeah, that was weird.
Yeah.
No, you were talking about how up until that point the barbecue belter kind of only felt like another weapon in the arsenal.
Yeah, it kind of just felt like, I'm trying to think of an example, but it's like in kind of like in a build engine game where it's like they tend to have like overbearing arsenals where there's just too many guns that don't really serve a purpose. It's like the Devastator in Duke Nukem or something, where it's like, this is just kind of here. It's kind of just a faster firing, weaker rocket launcher.
Right.
Like it's not that valuable. You could cut it and not much would really be lost. And I was worried. I was like, this is a really powerful weapon, but it just doesn't feel like it's contributing enough to the combat loop. And as soon as we introduced that, I was like, this is great. This feels amazing. Because it's like, now it's like, do you want to save this really powerful weapon for when you have a really dangerous enemy, or do you want to use it specifically when you have like shielded enemies to deal with? And we're actually incorporating, I think, another shielded enemy into the roster just to make sure that that it keeps that going into chapter 3.
Oh, okay. So then, like, okay, so keeping that in mind with a segue here, so like, one of the big things about Viscerafest is that it's an incredibly difficult game. Like, it's fair, it's fair, and I've come around to see the beauty in it. It feels very much like this living, breathing chessboard in which everything is placed in certain places for a very specific reason. And Civi called it the Dark Souls of FPS games, which I'm on board with. Like, I'm like, yep, no, this is the Dark Souls of FPS games. So keeping that in mind, when you are balancing everything, you've got your checks, your balances, you're considering the difficulty and what the player has to endure. Have there been any points, like, let me back up a second. Like, what do you do when you're taking into consideration that, like, specific level of difficulty, and like, have there been things where you've just been like with the 3 potatoes in the arena, where you've just been like, no, I gotta scale this down, this is way too much?
The final boss of chapter 2, well, actually, the train level of chapter 2 and the final boss of chapter 2 were 2 really bad, just painful examples. So for starters, we need to talk about chapter 2's development, because most of it was fine. Most of it was relatively smooth. And then we got to, like, the last 4 months. Everything happened in the last 4 months. Everything went wrong. Oh. So, first of all, we were idiots. Our publisher approached us and they said, hey, we think it would be best if you guys had some smaller content updates in between the major updates in order to make sure that everything goes smoothly.
Okay.
And, like, you know, make sure players are, like the game's being updated and players don't feel like there's radio silence and everything's dead now. And we were like, yeah, that makes sense. I didn't realize, though, that they were incorporating that into our main milestones.
Oh.
Don't be wrong. I don't think they tried to hoodwink us or anything.
Right.
I'm pretty sure they stated it, and I was an idiot. I just wasn't paying attention.
Right. You kicked yourself afterward, like, oh, got it, okay.
Yeah. We didn't realize that, and what very quickly happened was it was just too much work. And it was delaying everything. We were originally going to be implementing some of the Scully stuff in December. No, originally we were going to be adding the Scully stuff in October. But that got delayed till November because the Scully stuff was taking too long. And then that got delayed altogether because it was taking too long, and it was too buggy and too much of a mess. That put us behind by about 2 weeks in and of itself. Then we were working on... And so, like, that was already delaying us. But then... Marky still hadn't gotten anything done on the Chapter 2 soundtrack or audio.
Okay.
And as a consequence, I was like, hey, what's going on? We need to get things moving. Well, I love Marky, but he has been way too busy lately.
Right.
He was working as a level designer and a sound designer and a composer for 3D Realms during the past year.
Oh, wow.
I can't talk about the game in question he worked on, but he made the first level for an upcoming unannounced 3D Realms game.
Wow.
Wow. Yes.
That's amazing.
He had to quit being a level designer for them because he was taking on way too much work.
Right.
And he's still been taking on too much work, unfortunately.
Right.
Which meant he wasn't able to finish the Chapter 2 soundtrack in time for release.
Got it.
But for a while, we were trying to delay it so that he could finish it. Eventually, it just got down to the point where it's like the last couple of weeks, we were just like, okay, look, at this point, we just need the sound stuff done, because the sound stuff is absolutely mandatory.
Absolutely.
So we had him. We were all crunching to the final hour to get all that stuff done. But so there was that. So that was delaying things. Elijah caught COVID, which delayed us even more.
Oh shit.
I was down out of work for a week because our file sharing service that Unity uses to pass, so that we can pretty much instantaneously pass changes between the team, with a single click. that went down. I couldn't use it anymore, and so I wasn't able to do anything for an entire week. And there's more stuff that happened. We had a voice actor who became really controversial all of a sudden, so I had to panic and recast him. There was so much stuff that kept going wrong in like the last 3 months of development.
Good God.
Like Chapter 2 was supposed to come out at the beginning of February, and it didn't come out until a few days ago.
God, yeah, I remember that, and wow, I mean, all things considered, like the fact that you were able to get it out even a few days ago is just like, I mean, fucking good on you.
But anyways, getting back to the main point, why I brought all that stuff up. So we basically had about a period of a week to completely balance. No, 5 days to completely balance front to back Chapter 2 Level 6 on all difficulties and Chapter 2 Level 7 in time for our milestone, which was just to have Chapter 2 content complete. It didn't have to be bug fixed or anything. It just had to be like completable. You could play through it back to front. That's what that milestone was.
Okay.
And that was probably, I think we delivered that mid-February.
Wow.
Probably like the 20th of February or something like that. That's when we delivered that. And so I basically had 5 days to completely balance Chapter 2 Level 6, Chapter 2 Level 7, and its boss fight. Chapter 2 Level 6 I started working on. And I basically balanced the entire thing in 2 days. And basically when I'm first making a level, I'll do a rough balancing pass where all I do is I set up the 4th difficulty setting. And I just have like a rough approximation of like what I think the encounters are going to be and how I think everything's going to be set up. I couldn't balance the ammo for that level at first because we didn't have C2L5 done yet, which we're going to talk about that. I didn't have C2L5 done yet, so I couldn't balance the resources for Chapter 2 Level 6. So I was just testing it with infinite ammo to set up the basic enemy placements and stuff like that.
Okay.
When I finally was able to sit down and balance that level, oh boy. It was the hardest level of the game. And it couldn't be the hardest level of the game because it was not the final level of Chapter 2.
Right.
The final level of Chapter 2 has to be the hardest level of the game. And it was so difficult, but I couldn't just remove an enemy because so many enemies were like pivotal to certain encounters.
Right.
So what happened was, over the course of 8 hours, I was basically non-stop making minor tweaks and replaying through it. And by the end of it, I was so tired and so exhausted that I kind of just crashed. And then I had to do the same thing next day for Chapter 2 Level 7.
Oh my God.
So over the course of a 5 to 6 hour stint, I had to balance that entire level and all of its resources for every difficulty. And then the day after that, I had to do the same to Mortiz. And I think I just took a nap after Mortiz because I was so dead and tired.
Oh, yeah.
But Mortiz was way too hard for a long time. Like, basically, because, like, you know, in my mind, it's better to start harder and slowly roll it back. So that, because, like, you know, because we don't want, like, something to be underwhelming or too easy. Which, again, we'll have to talk about when it comes to Mortiz.
Right.
But Mortiz started out ridiculously hard. Like, and the issue was, at that point, I was so tired and so exhausted with having balanced the levels over the past 2 days that I was like, okay, am I just dying because I am tired and exhausted? Or am I dying because it's too hard?
Right. Like, where is the differential there?
Yeah, so basically, over a 5 to 6 hour period, it was just like relentlessly making minor tweaks, going and testing it, and seeing how it fared. And like that was those 2 levels, just relentlessly testing them to make over the course of like a really short stint of time and burning the crap out of me.
Oh my God.
Yeah, those levels were so brutal and so hard. Like, I cannot stress like how easy they are now compared to what they were.
That's saying
and it's
something.
still really hard.
Yeah, because I was like, yeah, no, that's saying something, but oh my god. Like, if they were that difficult before compared to what they are now, those two levels do not fuck around.
Yeah, and actually, the next patch is making some extensive changes to them, because one thing I personally, I don't think I took note of when I was working on them, there's a few moments where it's like we have a couple of really brutal encounters back to back, and from a pacing standpoint, I think it's just a little bit too much.
Sure.
So we've trimmed some things back. One of the really cruel things I didn't notice I was doing was there are so many stalkers in those last two levels.
Yeah, there are.
It almost, I was watching one streamer play through it. I was playing with the streamer playing through it, and I was like, oh my god, it's like, he was particularly sick of the stalkers.
Oh,
and it was like a punchline. It was like a punchline every single time one would show up. And I was just like, oh no.
Oh no.
I was using them way too liberally. Like, there were like in between minor encounters that were using stalkers in C2L6.
Yeah.
And it was kind of cruel. And like we also made a recent bouncing change that'll be in the next patch, where we put a timer on how long their homing projectile can stay on.
Yes.
Because before it would just zoom around forever, and you had to get rid of it.
Oh yeah.
And it was like, and even I was like, yeah, this is too much.
Yeah, I can hear that beeping in my sleep. Just those guys, that beep, 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 and I hear that, and I'm dodging and I'm jumping. I'm like, I just got to find a pillar or something. I just got to get behind. I just need a second, and I can.
One tactic I usually recommend is, because you're invincible when you dash, just dash into it.
Oh.
To get rid of them. But even still, like, that can be hard to do because you have to make sure there's just enough space that you won't like run into it before you perform the dash.
Oh, that's a very good point.
But yeah, it was too much. So we toned the stalkers down a little. I've toned down the amount of stalkers that appear, and I've generally paced things out so there aren't like. Because another example, the mini boss that becomes a regular enemy. That fight in C2L7, there's a really brutal fight like immediately after it. Like, as soon as like you finish that fight, it's like straight into another fight, and I was just like, yeah, this is too much. Where it's like, that's a moment where we need like a little bit of a pace break there, because it's like the room after that fight is like another brutal fight in and of itself. So I was like, just a little bit of room to breathe.
Got it.
But yeah, so yeah, there are plenty of times where I think I've overstepped my boundaries and we made things just a little bit too hard. One of the big things I think is worth noting is once Viscerafest is done, like we have all the levels done, I'm probably going to be completely rebalancing everything all over again.
Okay.
And the reason is because one of the big issues when you're balancing something, when you don't have the end in mind, is you have no idea how hard the ending is going to need to be, or how hard it's going to be, right?
Yeah, and that makes sense.
Because one issue right now is I am balancing toward an unknown. Like, if I continue the level of pacing and escalation that I have currently established, it is entirely possible that Chapter 3 will be impossible to beat if I were to maintain that. So what we're going to do is, once Chapter 3 is all done, we're going to go back through and completely reevaluate the game's pacing as a whole. So and that doesn't necessarily mean that the game will be easier throughout, but what it means is like the ramp up to how hard it gets might slow down a little.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And with that rebalancing, is that something that, say, like, so when you finish Chapter 3 and you're going to go back and rebalance it, does that mean once Chapter 3 is released, or once you have like completed Chapter 3 in-house and then you work on rebalancing everything before Chapter 3 comes out?
It'll be before Chapter 3 comes out.
Okay. That's really cool.
Yes. Yeah, because again, we don't want to balance toward an unknown. We want to make sure that like the final chapter feels appropriately challenging and not overbearing. I mean, like, it'll be overbearing for people, but we don't want it to be like cruel to the point that it feels like just unbearable to play through.
Sure.
And that chapter will be particularly interesting to balance because almost the entire enemy roster gets thrown out.
Wow, really?
Because, yes, don't get me wrong, you'll be seeing some cameo appearances from the USC here and there, but almost all the USC enemy types going forward are not going to be in Chapter 3 for the most part.
Really?
Chapter 3 is going to introduce 10 new enemies.
Oh my
that
god.
are, yes.
Oh my god.
It's going to be a nightmare for pacing.
Oh, holy shit. Yeah,
I'm kind of terrified.
Yeah, oh, fuck yeah, I bet you are. That's so much. That's like, hey, guess what? You guys have been so used to all of this, and you've gotten used to it, and now it's going out the door, and we're gonna introduce you to all this shit. Wowzers, bud. Holy shit.
Yeah. And the thing is, all the Chapter 3 enemies are so weird. They're probably, I think it's safe to say, they're probably some of the most unique enemy types in an FPS game, period.
Mm-hmm.
And even the ones where it's like, oh, you can clearly tell, like, this pulled this mechanic from another game.
Sure.
They're always, like, the really weird and quirky ones. Mm-hmm. So it's like, for example, there's an enemy in Chapter 3 we introduced called the Adopted Trooper. Mm-hmm. And the Adopted Trooper is basically a variant of the Chapter 1 enemy type, the Trooper that fires a 3-round burst. Right. And just like the Chapter 1 variant, it does fire a 3-round burst. But first of all, it leads its aim with that attack. It no longer just aims at where you are, it leads its aim with it. It also, as an alternate attack, will fire grenades.
Oh.
And it also resurrects like the zombies from Quake.
Oh my.
Unless you gibbet.
Oh my god. Oh god.
Like, there are lots of...
So you knock it down. Let's say you knock it down, and its body is lying there. Unless you go up and, like, you jib it, you punch it, or whatever. If you just leave it lying there, it will get up and resurrect.
Yes.
Wow.
And its corpse is a bit tankier than, like, other enemies, so you have to punch it a few times in order for it to actually dib.
Right.
You can just dib it outright. It's like a really heavy weapon, but generally speaking, it's like it would be a waste of ammo to do that, obviously. So exactly how we're going to balance what that looks like will be interesting. It's like there are lots of enemies where it's like, man, this is going to be a nightmare to balance resources around because there are so many potential variables and what could happen.
Right.
That it could lead to one of two extremes, where the player just like is playing really efficiently and has like overabundance because they know all the game's tricks and whatnot. Or, like, there will be people who are idiots, and they'll just keep not dribbling that enemy, and it will keep getting back up, and they'll just keep shooting at it again. There's lots of scenarios like that I potentially imagine happening.
Sure.
But yeah, like, the Chapter 3 enemies are super weird and super fun and really interesting. I've talked about the majority yet, but I am really excited for them. But I am slightly worried that we might be heading into, like, an enemy type version of Zen territory where the ideas almost become like, don't get me wrong, we will be aiming to make sure that it is bearable.
Right.
Like, we don't want this to be torturous.
Right.
Like, you know, I can tell when something isn't fun. Like when something just isn't enjoyable anymore.
Sure.
So we will be aiming to make sure that these new elements and these weird enemy types are not overbearing to the point where they are insufferable to deal with.
Right.
But it is something where I am slightly worried it's like almost too ambitious for its own good in a way that will make it very difficult to find a good middle ground.
Got it.
But it will be interesting. I am excited for it. It'll probably be the single most unique and potentially divisive part of the game.
See, and I find that really intriguing. I find that really intriguing because, like, just the notions of the ideas that you're putting forth for Chapter 3 right now that we're talking about, I'm like, oh, that sounds super different, and that sounds really wild, and, you know, like, the passion and the ideas right there, I'm already sold. And that's because, like, I love it when a game takes something and goes, I'm going to do something really nasty or really imaginative, and I'm just going to see if it works. It's like, even if it doesn't work entirely, like, seeing that, like, that passion and creativity getting put on display is fascinating and wonderful to me. That's part of why I really love the independent scene in the FPS community, because we're getting all of these games that are very artistic and passionate behind the scenes, and that people are getting to make because they want to make them. So we're getting all of these like incredible shooters like Herat, we've got Head On, and then we've also got here Viscerafest, and like what you're describing, I'm like, yes, push the boundaries, let's see if it works or not. And like, you know, like you've got a good head on your shoulders for this stuff. You follow your gut. It was I was talking to David Zemansky, and he was talking about Iron Lung and balancing all of that out, and how like when he realized, like, he was playing through the game and going like, oh man, I don't want to have to play through the entire hour of this game like all in one go and test everything. And he was like, oh, I'll add autosave. That's cool. And that makes it a lot easier to navigate through it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Just follow your gut, man. It sounds like that sounds awesome. Like, throw all the weird shit out there, make it fun. Like, I really like your comparison to Zen. Like, it could be like a Zen sort of thing, but like everyone remembers that though. Whether or not it, like, you hit that absolute 10 out of 10, or whether it just kind of falls a little short, like, that's the shit that people, no matter what, they remember that.
Yeah. And it's worth noting, the level design won't be painful like Zen is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, probably not.
Like that will be mostly working within the boundaries of kind of like what's been established as of Chapter 2.
Right.
We'll be more regularly using the sacrifices in Chapter 3. Like, basically, us using them prior to Chapter 3 is just setting them up so people know about them, and we don't have to tutorialize that stuff in Chapter 3 specifically.
Sure.
But, like, the plan for them was always to have them in Chapter 3 and use them mostly there.
Right.
Yeah, so for the most part, like, it's not, because the biggest issue, specifically the problem with Zen, is the pacing of Zen.
Yeah.
There are so many things that grind Zen's pacing to a halt, and that combined with the fact that Half-Life's control scheme is just not made for platforming,
right?
Because there's no air control, makes Zen miserable to play through.
Yeah.
So when I say these things will be like Zen, I'm referring more so to how Zen is merely a controversial piece of the game,
absolutely,
rather than it being like a literal example of like, oh, like the pacing is going to die.
Yeah. No. That was kind of what I picked up in your meaning when you said that.
Yeah.
Talking. No, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you're fine.
I was going to say, so, you know, kind of pulling off of you talking about air controls, right? One of the things that sets Viscerafest apart from some of the other shooters that are coming out is, I don't know if you specifically would define it as kind of like a movement shooter, but it feels like it's kind of in that category where there's a lot of jumping, dashing, utilizing your environment, more kinetic controls rather than like shuffling down a hallway and being this like space marine that can tank a lot of damage. So, and you mentioned earlier that Viscerafest started off more as a Halo type game, and then you started to incorporate more like retro 90s shooters mechanics. So then in that evolution, what drew you to the idea of that faster paced kinetic style where you're running, jumping, dashing with the iframe, stuff like that?
I'd say that was a relatively slow roll. So when I first started working on Viscerafest, I didn't even know what Doom was. Let me phrase that. When I first started working on what would become Viscerafest, I didn't know what Doom was. It wasn't until probably like 2013, 2014 that I was introduced to Doom for the first time. Wow. And as soon as I was playing like a crappy online shareware version of it like you had to use like the arrow keys to move around and stuff. I actually, for some reason, I remember enjoying it. But like, yeah, it was miserable to control, and like at that point, it was kind of just like, oh, here's like a cute old game I can play. At some point, I picked up a source port and actually started playing the game proper with modern controls. And it was like then that it clicked for me, just like how fast paced and action packed Doom was.
Right.
And for me, I loved that because the way I always played games was super aggressively. I was always like a lone wolf running in. And I remember I had a conversation with a friend of mine whilst we were playing a game together. He's like, if you stop running around and just like take cover and stuff, like you'll survive longer. And I was like, yeah, but there's no fun doing that.
Right.
So for me, when I was introduced to Doom for the first time, I was like, oh, here's a game that gets me.
Yep.
And I started rolling, would become Viscerafest into being more of a retro shooter. As for stuff like bunny hopping and whatnot, I think that started out as an accident. So in the really old versions of Viscerafest, there wasn't proper bunny hopping. It was running on the Blender game engine, and it was using a really simplistic movement system that didn't really factor in things like momentum. But when you held the space bar, you would just keep jumping, and because you wouldn't be touching the ground, there was less friction on your character, so moving in the air would be faster. And when you held W and like a strafe key, you would be moving faster because the crappy way that engine handled its movement stuff meant that like basically you would be pooling those two movement speeds into each other, meaning if you were moving diagonally, you were naturally moving faster. So when I was playtesting and working on that version of the game, I was naturally already like bouncing around and everything.
Sure.
Right. And then when we moved to working within Unity, I was just like, yeah, let's add like actual bunny hopping. But I didn't want it to be like Quake bunny hopping.
Yeah.
And I didn't want it to be like Dusk's bunny hopping. To basically summarize what I mean by either of those, with Quake's bunny hopping, you have very limited air control, right? So with Dusk's bunny hop, not Dusk, with Quake's bunny hopping, your air control is basically limited to your strafing. You can't you can't just like jump and change your direction in midair at any time, and that makes doing things like platforming miserable. Because you're not able to change your orientation, you're not able to really like affect how you're maneuvering unless you're using the strafe keys, and that just makes things obnoxious. It means that if like I'm making a jump, I have to commit to the jump, even if like I am undershooting it, and that means that there's no room for error, which is why platforming in so many first-person shooters sucks. When you're not able to like go back on a decision in the midst of platforming, it means that sometimes the movement physics will just screw you over. Sometimes you will just poorly judge something, and now that you've committed to it, you have to load a save anyways. It just makes platforming so much of a chore than it needs to be.
Yeah.
So I wanted to have always present air control, and so one of the big things we kind of pulled from on that respect was blood. Blood's movement, like you have like that full air control at all times. But blood doesn't really have bunny hopping. You can jump around and whatnot, and kind of do something similar to bunny hopping, but there's not momentum-based movement.
Right.
So then I didn't want it to be like Dusk, because with Dusk's movement, you have that full air control, but Dusk's movement is very artificial, where basically the way they the game doesn't have proper momentum. The way they handle your speed increase is the more times you jump, it's flatly adding to your speed, right? So basically, like, say, when I am jumping and moving by default, I'm moving at a speed of 1. When I make my second jump, it will add 2 to my speed. When I add a third jump, it will add 2 more to my speed. And it will kind of just constantly build up until it hits its upper limit at your max speed cap.
Okay.
It's not actual momentum. And what that means is that when, say, like, I make a jump, if I stop hitting the W key, I stop dead in the air and fall straight to the ground. And it leaves the movement feeling very artificial. And so we kind of wanted to hit Oh yeah, and the other thing it does is like one thing you can do in Quake that you can't in Dusk with its bunny hopping is if you let go of the movement keys and just keep jumping, you will keep heading in one straight direction, and you can turn your player character independently of the direction you're moving to. Right?
Yeah.
And I wanted to be able to do that kind of stuff. I wanted to have like the control that bunny hopping. I wanted to remove the lack of control that real bunny hopping from games like Quake provides, whilst having the level of air control that a game like Dusk has. So we spent a lot of time trying to find sort of the middle ground and create a system that sort of like swaps between the artificial elements of the bunny hopping and the more organic sides of the bunny hopping, flipping back and forth between those depending on the circumstance. So I think the way it works, if I remember off the top of my head, is when you bunny hop, you have, similar to Dusk, there's like a flat value being added to your movement speed. But that value doesn't actually control your movement speed. It's imparting momentum onto the player. So basically, it's saying, hey, like, this is what your momentum should be. We're going to kind of manipulate your momentum to push you faster. And it effectively, so it is sort of loosely artificial in a way.
Okay.
But yeah. Sorry, my brain's dying now. I'm effectively Elijah would be able to explain it much better than I can.
Sure. Okay.
But yeah, it's a very complicated system. Put it like that. I think we actually went. I think there were 13 different versions of the movement script that have been written up, like just completely scrapped and reworked from scratch.
Damn.
That's
neat. Wow. That's really cool. Especially, like, I really appreciate, like, the way that you were explaining that, like, the differences between, like, how you bunny hop in Quake, you bunny hop in Dusk, and all of that. The movement in, like, a lot of the more modern, like, you've got, like, Core, which just came out, you've got Viscerafest, Ultra Kill, the, like, running, jumping, a lot more control in movement, which is something that I really do appreciate. Which makes it hard for, like, when, you know, I go hop online with my brother and we go play, like, you know, let's go back into Borderlands 3 and let's go finish playing that. And I jump and I'm trying to control my character in the air and I'm like, oh, fuck. I'm subject to gravity and inertia now.
Well, one thing that bugs me with a lot of the more 2010s era shooters, like the 2010 mid-2000 shooters, is their movement sucks. And when I say their movement sucks, it's important to note what I am not saying. Mm-hmm. What I am not saying is that the movement needs to have super complicated, elaborate moves the player can pull off. The player needs to be able to bunny hop. The player needs to be able to dash. That's not what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is the basic act of holding W and moving forward feels like crap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because it's so much more complicated to make that feel grounded and feel like it has momentum and weight to it. Because, like, the way movement works in Viscerafest is you don't hold W and move forward. You hold W, and then what happens is there is, like, an acceleration. It's almost like you're moving a car, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like you hit W and you'll, like, immediately get kicked, like, let's say 30 miles per hour. Sure. But the longer you hold W, moving in that direction, it will slowly climb up to, say, 40 miles per hour or something like that. Mm-hmm. And that gives it prevents the movement from feeling very static and flat. Mm-hmm. And or similar thing with, like, jumping in so many games just feels super janky and weird.
Oh yeah,
because there's, like, either there's not enough weight put in behind it, that, like, the way the character reacts is almost non-existent a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. Like the jump, one of the biggest things is, like, there are so many games that have really bad jump arcs, where it's like basically when you're moving forward and jumping, you can draw, like, a line, basically a curve in the air that kind of dictates sort of where you start, where you are in the middle of your jump when you're at your highest peak, and then where you end. And so many games have just the worst jump arc. Like, that was one thing I spent a lot of time obsessing over with Viscerafest, is like, what does the jump arc feel like? Mm-hmm. How does it feel? Does it feel wrong? Do you fall too fast? Do you fall too slow? like Halo, for example, is a game that has forever, until probably Infinite, had a terrible jump hunt.
Ooh.
Yeah, like it drives me insane that game's jumping.
I'm gonna be getting into that eventually when I'm doing a series of videos. I've never played Halo. I think I played it once or twice multiplayer with some friends of mine because they were like, I'm tired of Modern Warfare 3, and I was just like, okay, you want to do Halo multiplayer? Okay. So I have never played Halo. I have no frame of reference for that jump. But like everything I've ever seen of Halo, I've always been like, maybe I'll try that next year.
Yeah. The issue with Halo's jump is it's way too slow, and you don't have enough control in the air. So what happens is basically it has a very tight jump arc where the peak of your jump is really high, but the ends are really close together. If that makes any sense. So it's basically like you're not moving that far horizontally, but you're moving really far vertically.
Okay.
And that feels terrible.
Yeah, that's not really much of an arc.
Yeah, and secondly, when you're in the air, what ends up happening is you have barely any air control in Halo, and you spend so much time in the air whenever you jump. And so I'm sure part of that's intentional because they kind of don't want you to be bunny hopping around and everything.
Right.
But they didn't find enough of a good middle ground to where it feels good to jump. You just feel like helpless when you're in the air. Like it's like in Quake. You know how like in Quake when you jump forward, it's like you're committed to that jump. Basically, wherever that arc, wherever you've jumped to, like you can't change your direction now. Like if you backpedal, it will stop you dead in the air, but you can't go back or whatever. Halo is like that, except you spend so much more time in the air than you do in Quake.
Mm-hmm.
And you probably have even less air control than you do in Quake, especially if you're not factoring in things like Stray. But yeah, like there's so many like mid 2000s, 2010s shooters that just have like the worst jump arcs and your standard walking. It sounds really silly, but like it affects how a game feels so much.
It's true,
and it's something that we spent a lot of time obsessing over because moving it from location to location is one of the main things you will be doing in a game.
Exactly.
So just making sure that feels at least decent is one of the most important things you can do.
100%. Hard agree on that. And like those 2010 shooters, since so many of them were concerned with being cover-based, you want to find cover so you can regenerate your health and all of that. Like, I imagine that all of those notions, like the running, the jumping, and all of that weren't really truly put into too much consideration or scrutiny because the popping out of cover to shoot and then ducking back under for regeneration was probably more of a focus. Especially in like those early Call of Duty games, the Halo games, stuff like that. So like,
I was gonna say, do you want to maybe talk about some of the story stuff now?
Oh, 100%, please and thank you, because like this for me, playing through Chapter 1 when we hit that one level where it just took that left turn and went super Lovecraftian and all about the story, you fucking hooked me. Like, I was into the game at that point. I was like, yeah, this is good, this is fun, I'm playing it. And then you took that left turn and I was like, you son of a bitch, this is good. This is, like, it was so fucking mind-blowing for me. Like, I hate showing any footage of that whenever let's see, so far in my review of Chapter 1, I think I showed brief footage of the level, but it's super unrelated so that no one would see any of it coming. And in my review of Chapter 2, I also used brief footage of the one level where you did a similar bit with the story, but so that people also wouldn't know what was coming. Because that is crazy. Like what you're doing with the story and the slow burn and the like the quick twist reveals are nuts. As someone who loves to write stories, I am fucking envious of what you've got going on here. Like, yeah, let's talk about the story. Like, what were some of your influences here? Like, obviously there's some like Lovecraftian stuff going on, but like, what sort of influences, inspirations are you pulling in the writing and crafting of the story?
Well, so for starters, it's worth noting Viscerafest underwent a major rewrite in 2016.
Okay.
Uh, the original plan for Viscerafest story was you were going to be playing as Carolyn, who was a teenage girl, who was being used as a test subject for bioweapons by the United Scientific Conglomerate.
Okay.
The United Scientific Conglomerate were basically mass manufacturing a series of bioweapons that they were going to be using, and as Carolyn, basically you'd escape. You'd basically don like power armor, basically, and basically try to topple the USC's various facilities and whatnot. So what was going to happen was you'd start on their space station, you'd go to Earth in Japan, you'd go to Greenland, then you'd go to the Grand Canyon in a zone known as the Fractured Zone, where basically gravity there was all messed up, and like that part of the world has basically been shattered.
Ooh.
That was the original plan for the story. It got cut out because it was way too melodramatic.
Sure.
It was played super straight and super serious. And whilst I was working on chapter 1, I was just like, man, these two things do not mix.
Right. Right.
And it's just like this bright, colorful neon shooter having this like super, like I'm not even going into the melodramatic parts, but there were so many just like little things where it was like, man, this is like playing it way too straight and way too serious and way too dry for this kind of game. So I think at that point we had established Athens as a character in the story. He was going to be sort of like a helper character. He was going to be a defector from the United Scientific Conglomerate. He was going to be one of the little trooper enemy types, like the little one-eyed green aliens, basically. He's going to defect from them, and he was going to be helping the player basically escape and overthrow the USC throughout the course of the game.
Okay.
And I had been playing with the idea in that version of the story that they would have a relationship. So when I sat down to do the rewrite for Viscerafest, I was like, hey, why not then just have them get married or whatever? And like the entire game is just like her trying to get a wedding ring. I thought that would be like
so fucking clever and simple, and I love that. Like, I love that her whole motivation is like, I need money. I want to put a ring on it. Ooh, let's go after this bounty. It's like, done. You sold me. That's it.
Yeah. It was like, basically at that point, I was looking for something to where it was like immediately, right off the bat, I was like, okay, we're taking this less seriously, right? That was sort of my starting point, was I was like, okay, this is where we are beginning. I still wanted to use and incorporate some of the lore regarding the United Scientific Conglomerate and the universe as a whole I had built up to that point. But that was where I was starting, was with that. Basically, Carolyn wants a wedding ring, and so she can propose to her boyfriend, so she's going to take on this job to hunt down this guy within the USC, and we'll go from there. Excuse me, I'm just burping. So that was where we started. Around this time, I was getting super into Quake. I fell in love with Quake real hard.
It's some of the inspirations in Viscerafest I can see, and like as someone who loves Quake, like I've got a lot of appreciation for that.
Yeah. So I was falling in love with Quake, and I was like, hey, I've been hearing that this game was heavily inspired by a little author known as H.P. Lovecraft. And I keep hearing about this guy, and I have no idea what his deal is. I'm going to listen to one of the most well-known books he's ever written, called The Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah.
And so I did. And like instantly I fell in love with his books. I was like binging so many different Lovecraft stories. And it was to the point where I was like, okay, the next game I'm going to work on is going to be a Lovecraft game. Like, it has to be. Like, I love this so much now. I love this universe. I love its ideas. I love, like, the whole cosmic horror type thing. I'm like, this is going to be, next game I'm going to make, like, a cosmic horror type game. And eventually I just became, like, so obsessed with it. I was like, okay, no, you have to do this now.
Right.
So I had kind of been going a little bit of a direction in the early writing and drafting periods of the current version of Viscerafest's story, as I was kind of figuring out what was going to happen, where I was like, I can work this in pretty easily at this point. So I sat down and I decided, hey, this is going to be a game that takes place in the Cthulhu mythos. And and I'm going to kind of figure out what that's going to mean, how it's going to pan out, where it's going to go, what it means for a protagonist, what that means for the universe as a whole. I'm going to find ways to incorporate that in. And I want to do it as respectfully to the source material as possible, whilst also doing my own spin. So basically, kind of the direction I decided to end up going was Chapter 1 was going to introduce itself. It was going to present itself as a very bright, colorful, fun, neon-tinged retro shooter that was going to be goofy, zany, build engine, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That was where we were going to start. But it was all going to be a ruse. And we were all doing it just to bait the player into thinking the game's going to be something else. And a lot of that is baked directly into Carolyn. Kind of one of the perspectives, I don't think anybody else has ever said this, and I'm about to sound like the biggest, like, smelling his own farts nerd ever.
Perfect. Do it. Do it.
The build engine games are a beautiful example of their protagonists basically being a perfect mirror of the game they inhabit, right? Like, all the ways you can describe Blood, all the ways you can describe Duke Nukem, all the ways you can describe Shadow Warrior, you can say the exact same thing about its protagonists. And I wanted to do the same thing with Viscerafest. I wanted Carolyn to be a perfect mirror of the game that she inhabited. And so I did a lot of basically trying to, again, figure out her as a character and figure out what the greater whole of the game was going to be. Mm-hmm. So on the outside, there's this mirror that he's this really fun, chaotic, psychotic bounty hunter who's just got like this bright, colorful appearance or whatever. But behind that, you can clearly see, even from the outset of the game, more going on. And that it's more complicated than just the surface level that is being presented to you. She looks ever so slightly off to the point where she's not quite human. There's just a couple of little oddities. And I can't entirely go into what that's fully going to mean yet, because some of that gets into content that will be tackled in Chapter 3. I wanted her to be a perfect mirror of the game itself. So basically, the way we start out, game, bright, colorful, goofy, neon shooter. Chapter 1, we start teasing. We just start throwing little hints at the player. We say, hey, more is going on, but it's presented in such a way that you can kind of just brush it off, right?
Sure.
You know, like, Ortiz is doing the standard villain speech. Oh, you don't understand what's going on. Oh, there's so much more here than you can possibly fathom. And, like, all of it's like, oh my god, whatever. Like, he's Samuel Hayden-y, basically.
Yeah.
And everybody, like, they see Caroline and she's just, yeah, who cares? And besides everybody's reaction, it's like, oh, who cares? Like, it doesn't matter. It's noise in the wind. Clearly he's a bad guy, up to bad stuff or whatever. And sure, I might not be morally correct in what I'm doing either, but, he's a villain or whatever. Just doing his standard villain speech.
Right, yeah.
And then you get to Chapter 2, Level 6. So, throughout the early part of the game, we've basically been teasing that the United Scientific Conglomerate has been working on slipgates and slip tech, basically. In Chapter 1, Level 6, or in C1L5, actually, I would say, we basically fully reveal that information, where it's like, yes, they are full-on working with portal play. Right. And the level ends with, like, you basically teleporting you and a chunk of the station into a dimension known as the Great Divide, where we introduce some stuff that's going on behind the scenes. We introduce a new character whose name we still haven't revealed yet, but we will call him Redacted.
Okay, I like that.
We introduce that there are some other entities and whatnot that reside in this location that are, let's say, keeping a very close eye on.
Now, quick segue for a second before we get back to that. The voice of Redacted, the character of Redacted that we see at the end of that level that's talking to Caroline, is that the same entity that we saw behind the force fields in Chapter 2 outside? I think it's a level.
No.
Okay, no, not the same one.
So it was originally.
Okay.
It was originally. But That's a different character in the story.
Okay.
That will become relevant later in Chapter 3.
Okay.
What happened was we were originally going to introduce that character there instead,
Mm-hmm.
but due to some rewrites that happened sort of during Chapter 1's production, we had all the assets for that stuff made up, so we kind of had to use them, and we're actually going to be replacing them in the finished game.
Oh, okay, cool.
So that sequence will be a little bit different in the final game.
Okay.
Yeah, currently the thing that is there is not him, but it will be him.
Awesome.
Redacted is the character that is helping Chromium toward the end of the chapter.
Oh.
That voice is, I mean, like, you can kind of tell because it's the same voice, but I don't necessarily know that most people are fully aware. So yes, that is the same character who is helping Chromium.
Okay.
So we basically tease, like, hey, there's a bit more going on here, and now you're finally getting a little bit of a taste of it. You have no context for what any of this information means, which is intentional. We didn't want, like, basically, by the time you finish Chapter 1, nobody has been able to guess what was going to happen in the rest of the game. Like, every single guess I've gotten was completely wrong.
Which is wonderful.
Which was intentional. Yeah,
yes.
We wanted to keep it vague enough that you could understand what was going on in the moment, but you couldn't see far enough ahead to be able to basically guess where the game is going.
Right.
But then the chapter ends, and you really start getting hints with Chromium and Redacted about kind of the more of what's going on. You're being given a sense of the scale of what's happening, even if you don't have enough context that you can really piece any information together. So then we get to Chapter 2, and it kind of starts out in a similar vein to Chapter 1, where it's still kind of fun, still kind of popping, but there's clearly starting to be a bit of a tonal downsteer.
Yes.
Like, ever since C1L6, things are getting a little bit dark. Things are getting a little bit more serious.
Yes.
The levels are, I don't want to say they're less colorful, but they're more moody, right?
That I definitely felt. I definitely felt that when I was playing through. It comes across.
Yes. And then in C2L2, we introduce the Nomads. So the Nomads are characters I don't know that they have to fully explore throughout the course of the game, because they're more of like a side faction that is relevant to what's going on, but not that important. But the Nomads are introduced there, and they're basically there to hint, like, okay, like, to be another hint, like, there's more going on, there's more going on, there's more going on.
Right.
Like, you see, like, they've been performing rituals, and they have, like, these weird stones that have, like, flesh pouring out of them, and like, they're clearly pissed at the Deep Ones, who are a creature directly, like, the game, like I said, is directly set within the Lovecraft mythos, and the Deep Ones are, like, absolutely pulled from the Lovecraft mythos.
Right.
And contextually, that's actually something that's really fun, and is more of a small lore detail. So humanity is mostly extinct in the Viscerafest universe.
Really?
There is there is only a small fraction of humanity left, and the bulk of humanity is being held in, like, basically breeding camps to prevent them from going extinct.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Oh shit.
And like, not even on Earth and, like, other worlds, but basically, Earth underwent a period where it was basically like in a post-apocalypse, with, like, most of Earth's important resources being extracted, and just basically the world was being strip mined. And, like, chapter 2's version of Earth takes a long ways after that had happened, where now that, like, things are starting to sprout back to life and everything, the Deep Ones have basically risen out of the oceans to basically take over the land, and they are the dominant life form on Earth now. There are a few humans on Earth left, but they are mostly being used as a means for the Deep Ones to basically grow their numbers. Because in Lovecraft lore, the Deep Ones, they cannot breed. They cannot, like, intermingle with each other. They rely on, like, humans to multiply. So basically, humans on Earth are just treated as slaves for the Deep Ones. And so there's a conflict between the Nomads and the Deep Ones, because, like, the Nomads, who are they're a nomadic Turkish cult they are, like their people have been being enslaved by and being basically dragged out by the Deep Ones. And so it's like they clearly have a deep, deep, deep hatred of them.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that because like they're strung up on the walls, their hearts have been ripped out.
Yeah,
They're
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
on pikes. Like there's actually one of my favorite bits, visual storytelling, that I don't think that anyone has noticed. So in the third level of chapter 2, there's like that little house, and there's like outside of the house, there's like there are Deep Ones hung up on pikes, and you can see like there are blood trails leading to where they were. There are shotgun shells on the floor, implying like and like the doors are barricaded. So like you can clearly tell it's like the Deep Ones were basically fending off from the cult.
Oh, because I noticed the house and I remember seeing them up on pikes, but like I missed those other little bits.
Yeah, but there's lots of like I love doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It's just like these little hints to kind of like just little bits of world building that most people will probably never notice, but is really fun.
But then it's there. That's so cool.
Yeah, but then in chapter 2, level 3, we directly introduce that the cult are interfering with whatever the USC are trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
Chapter 2, level 4 is actually hinted at in chapter 1. So in Slipgate Central, right at the beginning of the level, there's a little dialogue between the scientist and Dr. Mortiz.
Mm-hmm.
And the scientist says that the nomads have overtaken Facility 1764. And Dr. Mortiz responds that he wants a small squad to be sent out there to basically clean things up and make sure that that there's nothing the cult can salvage. And then at the beginning of chapter 2, level 4, you hear a scientist say, "We've managed to retake Facility 1764, but the cultists have let something loose in the facility." So chapter 2, level 4, like that facility that you're going through, that is hinted at in chapter 1. And we did that because we knew this is going to be a significant location. And it was actually meant to be more significant than it ended up being.
Mm-hmm.
It's right now it's kind of just the springboard for much more important events in the story.
Mm-hmm.
But like C2L4 and C2L5 were originally all supposed to be one level.
Oh wow.
Which is a big part of why we were hinting at and had added in chapter 1. Right. But what's being implied there is that the nomads are stealing, using, and it's like it's said, but it's said in a way that I think most people miss it. The nomads are stealing the slip tech that the USC is building. Mm-hmm. They're basically like they're stealing the portal tech and whatnot. And you will actually like that's another thing that will be addressed very early on in chapter 3 is you will see them coming through the slip tech and whatnot. Mm-hmm. Like you'll see them coming out of portals, which is a big justification for like why they'll be in chapter 3.
Okay.
But so all that stuff is established there. At the end of the chapter, at the end of that level, you fight a Shambler, which the big reason why the Shambler is there is because basically what Shamblers were in the Lovecraft mythos is they're basically interdimensional hunters.
Oh.
Whenever they like sense a disturbance, something that's like disrupting like the fabric within a dimension, they will basically just travel there to hunt down whatever it is that is causing that.
Oh.
They're sort of like basically think of like it's a lion that can teleport, where it's like it's smelling that something is messing with dimensional fabric, and it's going to go there to hunt and kill that thing so it can eat.
Oh, that's really fucking cool.
So we were like, this would be a really fun way to introduce a Shambler. And it's because like another big thing is I wanted to have some Quake stuff in Viscerafest, but the way Quake handles its Lovecraft mythos stuff is kind of all nonsense.
Sure.
Because like it implies all the monsters are children of Shub-Niggurath, which is not the case. Like almost none of the creatures there are actually children of Shub-Niggurath. And the Shamblers are an example of that, where it's like, no, this is just a creature in the mythos. It has nothing to do with Shub-Niggurath. But we wanted to include him. We thought that would be really fun. We thought that'd be a really cute surprise. And again, that's something we've been planning to do since 2016, was to have Shamblers in the game.
And it was a great reveal. It was a great reveal. It was a great fight. I was just like, oh, you son of a bitch. It's so good. So good. And then the spawnlings, were they also kind of Quake inspired, the spawns that show up throughout episode 4 in there?
So they are inspired by Quake, but they are not the same creatures from Quake.
Sure.
The Quake creatures are the children of a god called Sithagua.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why they behave the way they do in Quake, but in actual Lovecraft lore, they're shapeshifters.
Mm-hmm.
Because the idea is basically they're just this blobby, formless mass that can like just take on different forms and whatever.
Okay.
But yeah, no, they're not the same creature in the Lovecraft mythos, which I will actually get to in a second as we go into CQL5. But so level ends. A cultist activates the arc gate, and you end up once again. A chunk of that facility is taken to the Great Divide.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that will be explained in the game, but there is actually a rule set to how the arc gates specifically behave.
Mm-hmm.
So, arc gates need an end destination, basically. Like a slip gate can only travel to an area within a dimension.
Okay.
So, like basically, I couldn't travel to like some weird other dimension from Earth if I had a slip gate. I would only be able to like travel to like Mars or something like that,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
An arc gate is what you need to use to travel between dimensions. And in between dimensions is an area known as the Great Divide. And it is effectively just sort of a middle ground that like all dimensions are connected, pass through, which will be important in a second. But basically, the way it works is if an arc gate is activated without an end destination, it will basically take everything in the area around it and teleport it to a location within the Great Divide, because it is not able to basically find an end destination. Whereas what's supposed to happen is when you have an end destination, it basically swaps the gates. So the arc gate from the other dimension will now take up residence in the current dimension, and your arc gate will take up residence there to form the bridge between the two locations.
Interesting.
So you'll notice at the end of chapter 2, there's a big arc gate in that arena, and you can kind of tell it's a little bit hidden because it's behind a laser wall.
Mm-hmm.
But like it is using geometry and it is using like brick and pile and stuff that's from chapter 3, like a chapter 3 location.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I'm picturing it in my head now. I'm listening to you describe it, and I'm thinking about it, and I'm like thinking about the laser field. I'm like, oh shit, yeah, no, I see it because I remember very specifically like trying to find my way around, trying to find the switch that would lower that force field so I could utilize that gate, because I was convinced I had to utilize that gate, and then I ended up just having to move on. Mm-hmm. But that's using assets from chapter 3 because it's from a different dimension where that gate is.
Yes.
Wow.
So you actually get to see the arc gate right at the final shot of the chapter, mm-hmm. In the final cutscene. Yeah, so that's how it works. But anyways, so that entire location doesn't have an end destination when the cultist is typing and messing with the keypad stuff. It just ends up teleporting you into the Great Divide once again. But now, at the end of chapter 1, you alerted something to your presence. And so now, when you come back there, it is aware of who and what you are. Mm-hmm. And about halfway through the level, it is introduced that Yog-Sothoth, the outer god, is in the Great Divide because Yog-Sothoth is the Great Divide. Oh. Pretty much anything that has blue spheres in it, like that is a piece of Yog-Sothoth. So basically, a common interpretation of what Yog-Sothoth looks like is he's basically an ever-shifting, ever-growing, and ever-expanding array of spheres, mm-hmm. Which is sort of supposed to imply his ties to knowledge. Like, basically, a very simplistic way of talking about it is Yog-Sothoth is the god of knowledge in the Lovecraft mythos. And it is... and so the idea we sort of went with in Viscerafest is we went with that idea, but it's like, okay, is basically Yog-Sothoth is one single consciousness that is a part of an ever-expanding and ever-growing series of spheres that separate off and become their own independent entities that he is basically directly a part of and working through. So all the spawnlings all the Watchers, like all the spheres, like that are like a part of like the level geometry and stuff. All of that is Yog-Sothoth.
Wow. Damn.
So he is like fully aware of where you are and what you are doing at all times. And it's like now that you are there and he knows what you are, he's like, okay.
Holy shit.
So basically, about halfway through the chapter, he ends up finding you and he ends up confronting you.
Mm-hmm.
He reveals that he knows a heck of a lot more about Carolyn than she necessarily does.
Yeah, that was a very surprising cutscene. I was just like, are you wait, what? No, is this implying what I think it's implying? What is this implying? Can you please tell me a little bit more? No, oh my god.
It's something I was so excited to make because it has been a part of the lore for Viscerafest for so long, and I didn't think I was going to be able to include it in the game. So I can't talk about specifically what Carolyn is just yet, because that's something that's revealed in Chapter 3.
Right.
But what I will say, what happens in that cutscene is that there is a woman by the name of Elizabeth Page. She is a normal woman, but she is marked with heterochromia of a very unique kind, where she has it's like an aqua-colored and an orange eye. Elizabeth Page is discovered by a cult, and she is impregnated with the child of something. Carolyn is that child.
Oh.
And what you end up seeing in that cutscene is obviously 2 months into her pregnancy, Carolyn is born.
Oh my god. Oh, Jesus, dude. Oh, that is so fucking cool.
But yeah, so then you are rescued by Redacted, who basically says like, I can't help you. I can't just send you back like I did before, because Yog-Sothoth knows I'm here now, so he's limiting what I can do. But I'm going to set you on a path where you can very quickly find your way back. And then that leads to obviously the train level, which not much happens there other than you crash a train. And then you get to C2L7, and there's actually a lot of fun stuff packed into that level. So there's a log left by Chromium that you find in his bedroom.
Yes.
So you find that log. Trying to think what he says there. So a couple of things. Chromium people are very religious. They they worship a lesser form of deity known as the Elder Gods, which is like when he says like, Nodens and Cathanid guide my steps, like he's referring to two of the Elder Gods. Or Elder Gods, sorry, not the Elder Gods. So he refers to them there, but specifically he mentions a location that's also mentioned in Chapter 1, which is Ranak Zethur, which is mentioned, I think, in C1L7, right toward the end of the map. And again, he mentions it here, and that is the other dimension that they're trying to get to. Or I should say, Chromium is in, and now Carolyn is trying to get to. What happened in Chapter 1, I mean, it's pretty clear, it's implied. Chromium is basically manning a USC facility. Some creatures that are within Ranak Zethur are they've found their location, they're hunting them down, and the facility ends up getting destroyed. Chromium almost dies before he's rescued by Redacted. And yeah, the main point of I can't remember everything that's said in that log right off the top of my head, but there will be more logs going forward as well that sort of flesh things out a bit more, and add more context. But yeah, so there's that, and then there is the end cutscene, where basically some of what's going on is being revealed. Right. Basically, Chromium's people were dying, and it's actually, my god, that was like one of the hardest cutscenes to write for, let me tell you.
Oh shit, I can only imagine. That was heavy.
So I want you to imagine when you're writing this, okay? Yeah. You have to take a story that is as long, winding, and complicated as the Fellowship of the Ring and condense it into a single paragraph.
Oh, okay.
And you have to get all of the important information within that paragraph. That is that flashback scene. Like, what's going on there is so much more complicated than what we actually fully divulge. Right. Because there's so much to it. Like, we weren't even able to get into why Chromium is wanted. He's basically wanted for having been a part of committing genocide. Wow. Because what actually ends up happening, and a part of why he is so guilty, or he feels so much guilt, is in him basically seeking the aid of another deity. He basically had a color out of space scenario where at first everything is great, but then the children are being born deformed, and the food is tasting disgusting because it's like so bittersweet and it's too rich, and there's just like all this terrible stuff happening, and everybody immediately, or I should say, over time, it's revealed that Chromium was responsible for what happened.
Right.
And as a consequence, very quickly everybody points to him as basically committing some act of black magic to basically cause this to his people. And once the Litholex, his people, and start basically, because they're already like on the fringes, but now they are like genuinely like basically dying out. The United Federations ends up intervening and basically doing what they did with humans and trying to repopulate them. Basically pulling them off of their world and attempting to help them. Because it's not like it's mentioned that there's a famine. It's not just that there's a famine. There's a famine. Basically, their women are becoming infertile, not able to have children. Wow. Like, basically, his people are dying off, which is why he grew so desperate.
Right.
And I'm explaining this very poorly, but basically, once Chromium, or once the Litholex are basically held by the United Federations, word about what happened, what Chromium did, ends up spreading very quickly. And everyone begins to fear Chromium as like this genocidal maniac. And I'll probably try to reveal this, because I do think it is pretty important information that you know why Chromium is wanted. But like, yeah, that's basically why Chromium is wanted. It spreads very quickly, and like various governments become very afraid of what he can do because you've seen what has happened to his people. That's why Chromium is wanted. That's basically a very short and less complicated summary of like some of what happened, and some of like what we'll try to explain in chapter 3. It'll be difficult because there's so much stuff that's got to get told in chapter 3.
Yeah, I could feel that you're coming down to it, and like the whittling process. Like, what are the important beats that we got to hit here while covering everything that we absolutely have to hit?
Yeah, but then it's revealed to see Chromium, and he's working with Redacted. They have reached a location called the Hall of Epiphany, because haha. His blood references. No, there's actually that entire sequence is full of so many references, because that it's not only is the Hall of Epiphany a reference to blood, it's also a reference to a map from Quake Arcane Dimensions called the Necromancer's Keep.
Ooh.
There's an end fight in a giant cylindrical library in that level, and that entire like area is basically mapped out to be a reference to that location.
Oh, it's so
but you can even
cool.
When the cutscene opens, you can actually like see the Quake doors open.
Yes, that's what I thought that was. Yes, amazing.
I thought, yeah, like, but yeah, because like chapter 3 is meant to be like basically chapter 1 is kind of like your Doom style location. Like, it's a very like, and there are lore reasons why the chapter 1 looks like it does, where it's just kind of like it's vaguely sensical. Like, you can tell what this location is supposed to be, but there's not enough detail in it that you can be like, oh, like this all is like very purposeful and build engine like. It's meant to be very Doom-like in its structure. Chapter 2 is meant to be very build engine, where it's like you have much more grounded, realistic locations for the most part. Where it's like you can kind of tell what this is and what its purpose is. And Chapter 3 is going to be a mix of Quake and Rise of the Triad in its level design, where there's a lot more verticality, there's a lot more traps, and yeah. So that'll be really fun. And we actually wanted to introduce some of that with Chapter 2 with like the jump pads and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I thought that would be a really fun, cute thing to do, especially because at that point in time, I wasn't able... I hadn't worked on the Hall of Epiphany level yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't able to like get an exact location mapped out for my artist to work with on that cutscene. So it was just like, hey, here's like an area that will work perfect from another map that we can use kind of as a reference for what we're doing here, or what this location's purpose will need to be in the actual game.
Nice.
Yeah, so it's basically you get a bit more hinting at of what's going on there between Commune and Redacted, as they're referring to a ritual and a child, which will become relevant to exactly what Commune did when he was working with that other god. And yeah, and then the chapter ends.
Oh man. Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's a lot to absorb. And you've still got more to come. And if you had told me that Viscerafest Chapter 1 would be a story-driven experience, and that Chapter 2 even more so, just by looking at it, I wouldn't have thought that. But like honestly, like as much as I love the mechanics of the game and I love the game feel, the story, like the way that you've implemented it, the very clearly thought out lore and direction and everything that you've put into it, and just within the game and what you have provided with what the player can see and experience in the game has been my favorite aspect of it, because it very, very clearly drives the game and informs the choices of not just the characters or the player, but also your development as well. And it keeps it very firmly in mind. And I love that. So like, hearing you go into all of that and like the explanations and like the thoughts and the wherefores and all of that, like that shit, that's amazing. And that, I think that's one of the aspects why Viscerafest like was, it would not leave my head, because I kept thinking about all of that in Chapter 1 and it would not, I could not get it out of my head, and I had to play it again and then come back around to it. And so to see that continue in Chapter 2, but also like keep continually laying groundwork, I think that also is why I'm when you say like, Chapter 3 might be, maybe a little divisive and we're doing all this stuff and it's gonna be weird, and I'm just like, I mean, based on what you've done so far, I am thoroughly sold. It's that I am so looking forward to all of that. So then
I'd say what is
no go ahead, finish up.
So I was gonna say probably the single most difficult part of handling all of this is just the kind of game Viscerafest is. It is a very fast-paced retro FPS, and that means we have a very limited amount of time. First of all, from a budgetary standpoint, we have tight limitations that kind of dictate some of what we can and can't do.
Right.
But the other big thing is just time. Because Viscerafest is a very fast-paced act.
Right.
You never want to have a point where you are overburdening the player with story. Mm-hmm. Because it tends to result in players becoming bored. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of players who will play through the game and just not be interested in the story. So we have to be very careful in terms of like how much information we give, where it's like, if you want it, it's there. Like, in a very Doom 2016 style way, it's like, if you want the information, like, it is there for you. Right. Like, a lot of the stuff I was talking about, like, a lot of it's implied. Not all of it is directly stated. Things like the conflict between the cultists and whatnot. Like, that's not necessary information for you. That's just stuff that's implied. Mm-hmm. Like, going deeper specifically into, like, what's going on with Chromium's story, it's like, that stuff is cool. It's interesting. Mm-hmm. But, like, for the most part, we can, like, basically incredibly simplify it and get the information out really quickly.
Right.
Like, not all of it is completely necessary information. So it's just, like, everything has to be, like, razor sharp, where, we're only telling the player exactly what they need to know, and if they don't care, they don't have to pay attention.
Right.
There are lots of times where like important dialogue will be happening while you're just playing the game. Like again, I think most people probably miss the fact that we can get C2L4 in C1L5.
Yeah.
I wager that's probably most people miss that, which probably doesn't help that everybody's probably jumping straight into Chapter 2 and not be playing through Chapter 1.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like a lot of that, there's a lot of stuff that's set up early on, and a lot of stuff that's implied, where it's like, yeah, we're going to be doing more with this, or this is just stuff where it's like it's not that it isn't important. It's necessary for you to know, but if you don't care, you don't need to know. Mm-hmm. You can get the basic gist of what's going on just by kind of loosely following the main story beats.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of information that is loosely tucked in there, and it's really difficult to do that. It's really difficult to walk that fine line where you are giving just enough information that you can keep people on the page you want them to be, mm-hmm. without like overburdening them with story information.
Yeah, I bet.
Especially when the story is as complex as Viscerafest's.
Yeah. Oh shit.
So
I guess I got two more questions for you. Number one, so you mentioned that you have work on a cutscene for Chapter 3 that you're going to be starting soon in a couple of months. Now, obviously, without making any hard promises, because you probably can't at this point, like, what do you think is the time frame that you're hoping to have Chapter 3 out? Because we had Chapter 1 released last May, and now we just had Chapter 2 this month in March. So, like, if you were saying what your hopes were, definitely not a hard promise, but you were hoping to maybe have Chapter 3, what's your time frame on that?
According to our milestone schedule, full release will be about this time next year.
Okay. Oh, wow. Yeah, awesome.
It might be a little bit later in the year. There are some particularly challenging things we have set out to work on, mm-hmm. Especially the final bosses. The Chapter 3 bosses, because there is more than one, just like there was in Chapter 2. Mm-hmm. There is more than one boss in Chapter 3. They are going to be some of the most ornate and difficult to do. I would almost quantify them as spectacle bosses. Ooh. Where, just like the scale and the complexity of what will be going on Hood is going to be a nightmare to work on. I am terrified. Like, I am so excited, but I am so terrified to work on those bits.
Oh, I bet.
Because I might have to drag Hakata to help me to help us with development on that. So he has more experience with what we'll be doing. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I kind of need. I think we might need some of his help.
But that's it's kind of like one of the best feelings. It's like to be super excited about it, but also like, oh yeah, that's gonna suck.
Yeah. So there's So my guess would probably be, I should say, according to our schedule, it will be sort of quarter 1 or quarter 2 next year.
Awesome.
Is when Chapter 3 is planned to come out, and I should say, I said we're working on a cutscene in a couple of months. Mm-hmm. We're already working on one of the Chapter 3 cutscenes right now.
Oh, okay, awesome. So we are just...
Yeah, there's more than... Yes. Like I've had... The last month, I've had Mariah Key working on... She sent me some storyboard stuff, and there is currently a couple of shots that she's working on right now, and she'll probably send me some updates tonight on what's going on with that. But yeah, what I was specifically saying we'll work on in a few months is the final cutscene of the game.
Wow. Yeah. Whew. Wow. I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to it. Everything about the game that you and everyone have worked on and have put out so far has been an absolute surprise for me. Like, I remember seeing some of the first shots of the game in motion, and it was like super bright and it felt kind of cartoony, very animated series, and I was like, I'm kind of more of a realistic style or something like that. I don't know. I put my nose in the air and it was just like, oh my goodness. But playing it and experiencing it has definitely made this absolutely one of my favorite games of the last couple of years. And so, like, yeah, I'm so looking forward to Chapter 3 and seeing where you take this and what you do with the story, because it's definitely been an experience. It's been an experience for me to approach a game the way it wants to be played and not just kind of like bumble in with my pride and go, no, I can handle difficulty. I can like, no, this is a hard game, buddy. You have to go in and respect the difficulty, and also just not taking something at face value, or at least my first impression of it. Because and since then I've had a couple of other indie FPS games. I don't know if you played Arcos, if you've seen that one.
I think I've heard of it.
Yeah, it's like a little voxel shooter. It's like a little 2D voxel shooter. It kind of plays like a Super Nintendo version of Heretic. And like at first glance, it's kind of cutesy, like a little Legend of Zelda FPS shooter. And I was just like, but diving in, it's like, oh yeah, don't judge by appearances. And no, man, Viscerafest was an absolute surprise for me to play and an absolute joy to play. And I'm really, really looking forward to seeing what you guys come up with for the finale of it. It's gonna be a lot of fun to see. And then I guess my last question before we go is, so were you really surprised at all that Athens kind of became a sex symbol?
A little bit, I'd say. I was certainly expecting more with Carolyn.
Yeah. Definitely.
I not intentionally, like that's never something I kind of strove to accomplish with her design. Was I didn't want her to be visually like unappealing and ugly or anything,
sure,
but I also didn't want her to be like objectively just like obnoxiously gorgeous or whatever.
Right.
With Athens, I kind of just, I mean, like there's a lot written into Athens' character that just isn't going to be in the game. You might get to see a little though.
That would be so
cool. But yeah, like Athens is actually a shockingly complicated character for how little he appears. Yeah, he kind of, like I mentioned, he was originally like a defector trooper from the United Scientific Conglomerate when we first envisioned him. And sort of that cutesy, like, one-eye alien type design was something we really wanted to keep. So what I did is I basically reworked him into a different species so he can kind of stand on his own as something separate from the conglomerate altogether. And it was really fun designing him, especially his arms. His arms were probably like the weirdest part that as far as like my creativity on his design went with. But yeah, I was certainly the fact that they are a couple is first of all something that's very rare in games in general.
True, yeah, very.
Which was one of the reasons why I really wanted to do it, not just because it was funny, but because I was just like, no, there's like, I can't think of any married couples in games.
Yeah, no.
But the other big thing was I was just like, it's a great way for like the main character to become immediately like where it's like even if like don't fully know enough about the character yet to where you're just like, oh man, this character sold me. Like it's a great way for you to go like, oh, she's pursuing a relationship with somebody. She is like actively like her entire goal is like something that's very relatable. Even if it's killing people.
Yeah.
Even if the method she's going about to achieve it are not normal, what she's trying to achieve is very like grounded and relatable, and it's very likable, and it imposes a lot on her that she is having a relationship with somebody. There's a lot of of things that like you can naturally assume based off of just like what little you were shown, and again it makes her like immediately endearing, and more so it makes like their relationship endearing, because it's like when you see them, like whilst you don't get a lot, you get the general sense that they're happy and that they love each other.
Oh yeah, 100%.
And so that's kind of where a lot of like what we were trying to do with that, like with him and that stuff. And Athens does become I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. You do get to see more of Athens. He's not just at the beginning of the game. But he's certainly more of a minor character than he is a pivotal character.
Okay.
But yeah, I was somewhat surprised by how much people took a liking to him.
The community loves him. It's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
He's just such a he's such a good boy. Like there's something like in his design, in the way that he and Caroline are presented together, and like just even the slight characterization, you can just tell that Athens is a good boy. Like that, I think that probably helped with the community really latching onto him there.
The fun thing is you'll get to hear him talk.
Oh yes, so looking forward to that.
It was funny. We had an internal joke going for a while. I was browsing, so casting any character is a friggin' nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I went through probably over the course of several days, I went through a good, like, 600 to 800 people trying to cast for Carolyn.
Yeah, wow.
Like, it was a nightmare. Like, because basically what you do is there are, like, various sites that you can go to that have, like, basically actors can present their portfolios, and you can like listen to some of their prior work and see what they've done. Every time I have to cast a character, I listen to like so many portfolios of just stuff, and I'm like, man, none of this is working for me. I spend like hours upon hours upon hours. But one thing that was really funny, whilst I was looking through and doing the casting for Athens, was I stumbled across Drew Coombs. And do you know who Drew Coombs is?
No.
He is the voice actor for Dante from Devil May Cry and Devil May Cry 1.
No way. You're shitting me.
No. His portfolio was on that site, and I could he's not playing Athens. His voice is not fit.
But still.
But I was joking with everybody. I was like, Drew Coombs is going to play Athens.
That would be amazing.
I was like, that would be so funny.
That would be hilarious.
He's not going to, because again, his voice just doesn't fit the character.
Got it.
And then actually, Athens once again was a pain to cast for. It's like, again, there's just like everyone who's like has their portfolios on those sites and whatnot. It's all like the deep trailer guy voices.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that is not what it's supposed to sound like.
Right.
So yeah, I did manage to find somebody. I'll be ringing him up relatively soon. So yeah, it'll be fun.
Dude. Oh, I can't wait to hear that voice. I can't wait to hear Athens actually talking. That's going to be a game changer, and the community's going to be all over it. Well, but thank you so much for being able to sit down and chat and talk about the game. Like I said, it's been one of my favorite releases of the last year, and being able to talk about your experience creating it and all the behind the scenes shit, like that's all super fascinating to me, and I'm really, really looking forward to seeing what you guys come up with Chapter 3. Anyways, that's all the time that we've got. So, kids, thank you for listening in. Go check out Viscerafest. Chapter 2 is released. It's all in early access. It's over on Steam. Remember to stay hydrated. Roll your shoulders back when you're sitting up in your chair so you don't hunch over too much. And if you got more than 3 save beacons, it's probably time to drop one. We'll see you next time, kids.